My wife Karen and I were from Northfield on the second trip, and primarily it was Southeast Minnesota Synod, people from Mankato, Bryceland, Winona, Rochester, Faribault, and then we were from Northfield, and there were 10 of us total. Just to get you oriented again, this is where we were at. The very western edge of Texas, in El Paso is where we went and did some of our activities. And then Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is about 45 miles to the northwest of El Paso. This is a comparison between walls. The Berlin Wall is what you see on the left here, constructed in the city of Berlin in Germany, and that is what's referred to as the wall in the United States. It's actually, to me, more of a fence. To me, a wall means completely solid, but this is more fencing than it is wall, but it is very tall, and as you will see in another slide later, very tiny holes in the fencing. It's intentionally done so that all you can get is maybe a hand through. You cannot get a human head through it. This is a bit of a timeline that shows the differences in immigration due to changes in immigration law. If you look in the 1800s, the blue refers to European immigrants, and it's very heavily weighted to that. I would like to say something personal. My grandfather was an immigrant in 1909, and he came like today's immigrants. He came from a poverty area and political upheaval in Germany at the time. He had $30, he had a sponsor, and that's why he was able to make it. So he took a train from Ellis Island to Iowa, and that's where he got established in a German community, and that's kind of what is happening yet today. Generally, people have sponsors. They get to a place where they're comfortable in a community. In most of the cases from the southern borderlands, it's Hispanic communities. I'm not sure who it was last week, but either Gene or Bo or one of the speakers talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was done in 1892, very overt, intentionally made to prevent Chinese people of Chinese heritage not to come to the United States. And it was just outright racism. Over the years, you can see how immigration has changed. There's a huge dip in the 30s and 40s due to wars, and then it's slowly increased. But now you'll see the blue shows how much less there is of European immigration. It's becoming much more Asian and from the Americas. That's what the fencing looks like up close, and that's close to the actual size of the holes from what you see there. To show you the height, that's me. I'm 6'2", reaching up, and so you get an idea how high the fencing really is. The person on the right there is one of the people that was on our trip, Pastor Peg Morose from Bryceland. It says the fencing there is what's called the El Paso Borderland Patrol District. It's roughly 260 miles in length. The southern border is about 1,950 miles in length. This is the part that I'd like to go into a little more detail than last week. It is what we visited U.S. District Court, as did the group in the previous trip. It was in Las Cruces. It is not an immigration court, it is a district court. It's where they hear federal crimes. The crimes that day, there were 18 on the docket. Every one of them referred to immigration. Some of them were people who just came across the border, got caught. Generally what happens is they are returned within a few days, and but they are fingerprinted, they have eye retina scans, so they're on record for coming across illegally. And the scary thing about that is, for immigrants might not realize it at the time, but if you get caught twice, it's a felony. And people who've committed felonies are not allowed in the United States. So that gets to be a real risk for the people. So afterwards, we talked with the judge, and he said that when he started as U.S. magistrate 6 years ago, the cases regarding immigration were the exception. He had 1 or 2 a month, and now that day alone he had 18. So it just shows you, I think he said 75% of the cases he now hears are related to immigration. Also, if they want, one of the speakers named Crystal talked about, and I get confused by it. It gets so complicated. But the asylum process, it has to be regarding one of 5 categories. And the trouble for the people crossing is trying to prove it. Usually any documentation is lost in their travels, and most often they don't have any documentation to prove that they need to seek asylum anyway, because there are threats, but they're not written ones. Maybe a university professor is threatened and has documentation of that when they disagree with the political process or something, but most of the people simply don't have it. Border Servant Corps is a pretty amazing organization. They started 1997, just in a small church. I estimate it's smaller than this church when you can. And they started with 1 person, a couple volunteers, and now they have a staff of between 40 and 50 people. What amazes me is that they don't get burned out. They are just helping people on a daily basis, and it seems overwhelming to me. And you'd think that, you know, it almost would give me a fear of people just being a number, because they only stay there between 24 and 72 hours. So it's just trying to pass people on, move them on to their destination. They do have a pretty good relationship with Border Patrol and Department of Homeland Security, because those organizations want the people in a safe place. So they really do work with the government and law enforcement places there. They get screened, they get fed, they get a shower, they get clothing, appropriate clothing for where they're going. This is one of the places we went to that I don't believe the other group went to. It's called Weaving for Justice. It was at New Mexico State University, and they are more or less an outlet for co-ops in Mexico for people who want to earn money but either are unwilling to take the risk, or otherwise they can't afford to try and move, or they simply want to stay in their homeland. And this is the way they get money. They ship clothing to the United States, it gets sold, and then the money goes back to these kind of cottage industries in Mexico. And we have this high-priced model, my wife, who's going to show you some of the things that they've done. Do you want to stand up and show them?
So it was amazing to see. I don't need that.
You see, she has laryngitis, so. But anyways, this is some examples of what they do. It's beautiful. They do it, often what they do, you don't see it, but they tie it to a tree, And then they have this colorful, more or less handmade looms that they've done, and then they ship their products to the United States for sale. This is, don't want to repeat too much of what was said, but Lupita is this one person who about 35 to 40 years ago came to the United States as a teenager to try and earn money to help educate her siblings. She's the oldest of the children. In Mexico, they have to pay tuition. They do not get free public education at all. So you don't get educated if you can't afford it. So she would try and work and send money back to Mexico. She went back and forth a few times, usually very scary trips for her. She doesn't swim, and she would cross the river at unmarked areas. But she told her story, and her daughter to our left, her right there would be the interpreter, and she always said, "I'm learning more every time she tells the story." We also visited Annunciation House, which the other group talked about. This is a really impressive group of people. It is almost entirely volunteer. It's an old Catholic convent that a lot of retired nuns and a lot of volunteers in the area work, and pretty much they're exploited women. Women who have been traumatized on their trip, either sexually assaulted, robbed, threatened, and they are given a safe place to live. I think a lot of them do stay more than the 24 to 72 hours. Some stints need weeks of healing there. Then again, they go. And they try to, again, they have a good relationship also with Department of Homeland Security and the Border Patrol, because they're the ones who are often called and say, "How much room do you have for people today?" And they'll say, "We can take 150, whatever it might be." And then they try to get them healthy and find sponsors and move them on again. This is where I felt most challenged. The person named Ruben Garcia was pretty direct with us. And he said, you know, everybody can feel good by donating, coming and learning. But he said, what we really need is we need to send a bus to Minnesota. And a bus meaning 55 people. So that's really what they need more, is they need sponsorships, people who are willing to help people feel comfortable and get acclimated to a new language, a new culture, a new climate. So that was Reuben. This was another place that at the time, right now they are not receiving anybody, but they were kind of like Peace Central Lutheran in the fact that they at one time were a place where immigrants would go to get, again, clothing, meals, shower, a safe place to be. But they right now do not have anybody there. And finally, this is kind of a summary of how to help. The Southeast Minnesota Synod gets funds. They forward it to BSC stands for Border Servant Corps and Annunciation House, the two organizations that do tremendous work. And I'm sure their workers are either volunteer or get paid minimal stipends. Then they also have clothing requests, you know, especially coming to Minnesota, being prepared for winter. Books, Spanish books, just advocating for change and taking a trip yourselves. As some of you know, I'm a member at St. Dominic, and we have a very large congregation. It's between 20 and 25% of the congregation is Hispanic. And one of the things they finally did, it took a long time, But now we have a secretary who's fluent in actually Spanish is her first language. So one of the things that I was thinking about is to make a group of people from another country really feel welcome, you need to have that language. And one of them is church services. And I do not know where that would be other than right now, St. Dominic, because I can't think of another Spanish service. So that is one way that you need to make them feel comfortable, not just with socially, but also spiritually. Anybody have questions? Yes? Right. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, there is one in Faribault, but transportation gets to be an issue too. Now, volunteers, they're generally, I think people are pretty willing to do that piece of it. So thank you for pointing that out. Darlene, did you want to say something?
Well, maybe I should give my part, and then we'll do more questions as they come up. So, good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm going to report on what Frida, she was shown last week in one of the slides, and is a nurse. And what she's going to say, but she started at a South by thinking, what is your family story? Where did your ancestors come from and when? And why did they choose to leave their country and come here? So keep those questions in the back of your mind as we continue on. Frida worked as a nurse in various places around the world. She told us a lot about her time in Venezuela and how things developed there, but I can't get into all of that. She was spending some time in New Mexico with her daughter and really saw the need for medical help there, particularly for the people coming across the border. So she chose to stay there, and I'm not sure how many years she's been working there. She doesn't consider herself to be a political person, and she said she's somewhat conservative in her views, but liberal in her love. And that's what motivates her to stay there and work and help these immigrants. She kept repeating the phrase as she talked about different stories of, things are good until they're not. And I bet the people down in Mississippi and Alabama might say that today. They were hit by a very bad tornado Friday night, and 28 people were killed in that disaster. And as you know, we've had a lot of disasters around our country in different ways and in different times. So one of the reasons people come or migrate somewhere is because of natural disasters that makes their homes unlivable. And particularly in our southern neighbors, their governments do not provide help to help them rebuild. And so sometimes their crops are destroyed as well. There's a drought down in parts of Honduras that has wiped out a lot of the coffee plants. Well, you don't just replant the very next year and get a crop. So their devastation lasts for a very long time. And so that's one of the reasons why economic. The story about Venezuela shared a lot of the political reasons why people had to flee. A lot of times there's corruption involved, and then of course that leads to violence and war. So people leave for those reasons. There's lots of other reasons. One story I will tell you has to do with our other daughter-in-law, not Elga here, whom you've gotten to know a little bit. She's also from Honduras. Back in 97 or 98, when Hurricane Mitch hit Central America, there was a lot of rain on the interior part of the country and a lot of mud. And her mother was walking through the mud, cut her foot, got infection, and due to diabetes, the infection didn't heal and she eventually lost her leg. Well, diabetics need medication. They also need food. And in this case, they also needed a refrigerator to keep her medication in. None of that available to her. So our daughter-in-law came to the United States, pre-9/11 and to look for work so that she could help take care of her mother. Very similar story to what you heard last week about Carmen, who came because her daughter needed a kidney transplant. So what would you do for your mother, for your child, who needed serious medical help not available in the area where you lived? So that's one of the reasons why people migrate, because they care about their family, just like we all do. Other people come, when they can't feed their family, and they're looking for a way to provide. So those are just some of the reasons why people migrate. They don't come here just for fun, or it looks like a nice place to live. They're giving up a lot, and they know it's also very dangerous, and has become much more so in recent years. Now, if you think back in our history, back in the early 1800s, many of our southern states belonged to Mexico. And it wasn't until the Treaty of 1948, the Treaty of Guadalupe, when Mexico ceded over good parts of the states of California all the way through Texas to the United States. So there wasn't a rigid border between the two countries. And the whole border between Mexico and Texas is defined by the Rio Grande. And the Rio Grande has changed its path over the years too. It's not in the same place as it was back then, exactly. I mean, basically so, but not completely. But think about it, people lived all across that area, their families, their businesses, and they traveled back and forth. Our border was really quite porous to allow that freedom of travel to visit friends and family and stuff until 9/11. I mean, there was some structure in place before that, and of course our border laws and stuff, but 9/11 really made some big changes in how immigration was allowed to happen. I say we become somewhat reactionary. And that's understandable. We were scared after we were attacked on our own soil by a foreign country. But did we go too far and for too long? That's some questions I think we need to think about. Because policies affect people's lives, not just the statistics. Okay, so if you think of a human face on all those people that this law, and last week we had some handouts available, and you can still go to LIRS, not just the IRS, but the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. If you go to lirs.org, scroll down on that very first page a little ways, you'll see a big headline that refers to the Biden administration changes to the asylum law. You have time to click on the link down below where it says submit a comment, and then they ask you to revise a letter, because within that letter they ask you to put your own comments. And then you can submit that letter right online. The deadline is tomorrow, so that's the only way you could get it to them now. Why is that important? Because the changes that would be put in place with this administration's plan would mean that people seeking asylum, if they came through another country and did not apply for asylum there, they would not be allowed in. That would have kept Lisbeth out. I don't know Elizabeth's story at all, but I know she had to have come through Mexico because she presented at the border there. She would not be allowed to apply for asylum like she is now. There's some other things in regards to that, so you can go back in and read the whole article if you like. But yes, it affects individuals. And if we had not chosen to sponsor Elizabeth and her children after they got in, they likely would have been sent to a homeless shelter in New York City. Imagine yourself there. What would that have done? So our policies make a difference in people's lives. Now, immigrants can apply for a visa once to come here, but it can take up to 22 years. A lot depends on the country they're coming from. We're more likely to accept people from European countries because they look a lot like most of us, okay? The countries that are maybe most in need are the ones most often turned away. And once they get in, only about 2% of asylum seekers are granted asylum, and the rest are sent back, largely because they can't afford a lawyer, a good lawyer. So that's a, you think about a lot of people who are applying because they have a need and they're not allowed in anyway. Many people who try to come across the border don't even get a chance to ask. Although we, as a part of the United Nations, agreed to the International Human Rights document, which says that any person can approach a border to seek asylum, and that they have the right to a credible, fair hearing by an immigration judge, not just a border patrol agent or an airline person making that decision that, no, you can't apply for asylum, so you go right back. But that's what's happening to a lot of applicants now. And that's why many of them try to come across again. I mean, if they're just taken across the border and dumped into Mexico, who's waiting on the other side? A lot of cartels and other organized crime. And almost all of these immigrants, especially those coming through Mexico, have some contact with organized crime. Not because they want it, but because the organized crime seek them out and hold them for, charge them several $100s or whatever they can get out of them. And oftentimes they might say, here, take this backpack across for me and I'll charge you less. And that's how some drugs get into the United States. The people carrying it don't know what's in the backpack, but they get across and sometimes they're caught with that backpack and then charged. And that's a tough situation too. So it's very difficult, the whole process. People aren't leaving their home countries because it's easy, it's a nice vacation, It's a very risky process throughout. So I think I'm going to stop there so that we have some time for some questions that you might have from any of us here. So. Okay, then I'm going to ask a question of you. Where did your ancestors come from, and why did they choose to come here? Are there any Native Americans here? Okay, thank you. Pardon?
They came from somewhere too.
The
Navajo people came into Arizona in the 1500s. They came from Canada. They were here, I think it's the 1500s, the Navajos came to Arizona.
Okay. I did not know that, but so they came migrating down, but most of us have a different story. Yes, there's both.
My great-grandfather came from Ireland in 1840-something, and I just gave his paper to my eldest son, where he signed his name with an X because he could not write. And he came, I'm sure, from poverty. And he renounced his right to Queen Victoria and when he came to this country. So it was in the 1850s that he signed this paper. And he came into New York and followed the crops north into New York, upper New York State. And my family's been there ever since. Why? He came because they were starving in Ireland because of the potato famine that the British sort of caused let's say. But my other relatives, I don't know how they got here, but I know my mother was born in Canada and came here and when she was a child. So I don't know more.
My great-grandfather was from Germany. He immigrated in the mid-1800s. He and his friend, by the way, his name was Wilhelm Addix, and his friend was Friedrich Titi. Maybe the Titi name is familiar to you. But they left Germany to avoid being conscripted into the German army. And my grandfather, my father's father, came from Norway. And the reason why he came from Norway, or he and his parents, that he wanted to be with his Uncle John, who had already immigrated. And why he immigrated, no family story on that one.
Well, my great-grandfathers also came from Norway, and they came because most farms were about 6-7 acres. They would maybe support a father and one son, but that was all. But I also wanted to note that no one is granted asylum, no one, because of an economic reason. They can't say they want to live a better life or make more money, or they have to prove endangerment to be granted asylum. So nobody is coming and getting asylum because they say we want to have more money or live, more affluently. That is not a reason that will be granted. The other thing, there used to be a lot of companies, U.S. companies in El Paso, and now they're all in Juarez. And the reason they're there is they can pay workers there maybe $1 an hour. And if you don't like it, well, they'll find plenty of other people that'll work. So all of these companies have just really complete power. And they're in corruption with the government to get out of taxes and so on. The other thing, we often think about drugs coming into this country. And we might want to blame Mexico. And Ruben Garcia said, the problem is not Mexico. The problem is that we have millions of Americans who are addicted to drugs. And in this country, we have money. So as long as there is demand for drugs, and long as there is money, there will always be a way, no matter what kind of wall, no matter what kind of border patrol, no matter, ports of entry, there will always be a way for drugs to come into this country. The problem is not with Mexico. The problem is with our country. So those are just some comments that I wanted to make.
I can think I'm heard over the. My husband's grandfather came from Italy when he was 12 years old with his older sister. They arrived in New York City, and the next day he was out with a shoe shine box, and he was shining people's shoes at 12 years old. No education. He had a bandana tied with their food, and he lost his little cap. As they came into New York Harbor, it blew off his head. So that was my husband's side of the family story.
Where's, oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of genealogy stuff in my family, and my uncle has, and I'm actually making a documentary with my uncle about my great-grandfather. But my family on my dad's side has been in the U.S. for like 300 plus years, and it's funny getting DNA test results back because it's all like Northern European and British Isles, and then one county in Pennsylvania that they've been in since like the beginning of colonial times. And my uncle found a story of John Billington, who came on the Mayflower, or one of the ships with the Mayflower, and he was hired by the Puritans as a carpenter, and he wasn't a Puritan himself. And apparently his family got in a lot of trouble, a lot of times. And he was actually one of the first Europeans executed in North America because of a land dispute. He killed someone. But yeah, so that's a family history there.
Thank you for sharing.
My great-great-grandmother came from Germany in the mid-1800s at 15 with her 2 younger brothers and went to northern Illinois to a farming community where she said she was paid a banana at the end of the day, and she would go out in the cornfields and put her apron over her head and suck her thumb at the end of the day.
Oh,
My ancestors, particularly on my father's side, my great grandparents and before them, they were Cherokee, and of course had property and lived in South Carolina, and were members of the tribe that on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. My father was born in Oklahoma, and so they had no choice. I mean, they were already here when they, before anyone else. And I have a picture of my father and his siblings and parents moving from Oklahoma to Colorado in a covered wagon back in the mid-1910 to about 1915, 1920.
okay. In the last few minutes, I'd like to ask you to think about what are some things that we can do as individuals or as a congregation. Uh-huh. Oh, do they make pyramids, Karen? Yeah.
In that same vein, I'm wondering if they could be included in the alternative giving fair that we have during it.
Include them in the alternate giving fair at Christmas time. That's a good suggestion.
I remember just hearing constantly, and you referred to it, Darlene, that if people don't have good legal representation, they just have no hope of getting asylum. And I've got to think that for people going into the law, it's for probably not a lot of people that choose this area because your clients aren't, well resourced. So I'm just wondering if there's a legal fund that we could be contributing to as a church to maybe help booster the resources for folks looking for legal counsel.
I believe there is here. Do you have some?
One organization I know about, because our oldest daughter works for them, is the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. And they provide pro bono legal advice for immigration people. Yeah, and they're centered in St. Paul. But they have a whole network of lawyers who contribute their time to help immigrants.
I don't know if there's anybody on the welcome team that knows a little bit more about that, because we've been seeking legal help for Lisbeth. But I think the pro bono work takes a longer process than if you can get your own lawyer and make it simpler. But I mean, that's certainly a very good option.
I just want to make one comment about what we can do. I think one of the things that's most important for us to do is to recognize that the vast, vast majority of these people who present themselves at the border are victims. They're a tragic result of things in our world, and so it means we need to change our attitude in this country about immigrants that come across that border. It's unfortunate that after 9/11, we all know that we really got angry at people who attack us, and those were terrorists from the Middle East, but it didn't take very long until all of that suspicion and hatred got delivered over to Mexicans and others from south of the border that came, and it stuck. And so what we can do is speak up for them, to change our attitude and the attitude of our country. I think Ruben Garcia was absolutely right when he said the only comprehensive border reform that will help in this country is when we become enraged at the way in which migrants are treated in this world, and we who have so much don't do little to help them. I think that's a very significant thing. One other thing I want to share a little bit about, I was just totally surprised to hear that a significant number of people who come across the southern border now are from countries like Ukraine and Turkey and Afghanistan. A significant number who come. I had no idea of that. So we need to have a soul searching about how we think about those people who come to the border. If that happens in our country, I think something different can happen in all of this whole business. One other thing that I came to the conclusion as we were on it was sort of a sad conclusion for me, but I don't see an ending to this anytime soon. It's got us a long time to get us here. It'll take us a long time to get out from this, but we can do something to make that happen. Thank you.
One of the statistics I found was that in 2021, only 11,411 refugees were allowed into the United States. Now, some of that had to do with the COVID situation, but in 2016, there were 85,000 allowed in, and then President Trump capped the refugees at 18,000 in 2020. So you can see policies make a difference. But were you the one who told the starfish story? Okay, Mark was not here today. And many of you may have heard this story about the boy walking along the beach, picking up a starfish and throwing it into the ocean. And a man was watching him do that. And he said, "Why are you doing that?" And the boy said, "Well, if I don't, the starfish will die." But the man said, "There are so many starfish on the beach, you'll never make a difference." And the boy picked up another one and threw it back into the ocean. He says, "It makes a difference to this one." So how are we? We're at the end of our time. So thank you so much for coming and listening, and we hope to have more immigration presentations in the fall. Well, Barb?
I can speak loud.
Okay.
So you may have said this and I just missed it, but how many refugees are now allowed in the United States?
Well, we don't have statistics for 2022, or at least I don't, but that was from 2021. 11,411 refugees were allowed in. Yeah, at 18,000. So,
just one last comment. I'll be putting up some work in 2 weeks on the theme I've been working on for 10 years, whatever, based on migration and immigration. But there's one piece I'll be putting up. Anyway, one of the pieces that will be up in 2 weeks is a painting that I did that was based on one day unaccompanied youth were turned away from the border in 1 month. And so the piece I made, actually, is I made a painting doing 1,000 marks a day on drawing, and I did it for 18 days in a row to kind of document what it felt like to have 18,000 marks on this drawing that'll be up in 2 weeks. And then there's another series of 3, that's 631. There were 631 unaccompanied youth. That means 16 years old or younger were turned away in 1 day. That's the only I can count for 1 day. So there's some visual